Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine it is 1872. You are walking down this cobblestone street in New York City.
Yeah.
And you step into this dimly lit, smoky hall.
Right. Very atmospheric.
Yeah, exactly. And sitting on these wooden benches are men with calloused hands, soot-stained faces. I mean, these are the transient railroad laborers who literally built the nation's infrastructure with their own muscle, and they're just seeking a hot meal and a moment of reprieve from the brutal elements.
It's a very specific demographic, for sure.
But then you blink, and you fast forward a century to 1974. You step into a totally different building in this hollowed-out, concrete urban center. The faces looking back at you, they aren't those rugged, resilient men of the frontier anymore.
No, completely different.
Right. They're terrified, unwed mothers, elderly widows whose fixed incomes just, evaporated with inflation, and young men totally paralyzed by urban industrial alienation. I mean, the physical landscape of poverty completely mutated in the span of just 100 years.
Yeah, the sheer scale of that demographic earthquake is just staggering. And what we are looking at today is the desperate, highly coordinated attempt to build a system that was actually capable of addressing that mutation.
Which brings us to our source material.
Exactly. We are examining a specific text published in 1974 that serves as this hyper-specific blueprint for institutional compassion.
So we are taking a deep dive into Unto the Least of These. It's a massive handbook of specialized ministries in the rescue mission, written and compiled by William Seath for the International Union of Gospel Missions, or the IUGM.
Which is quite the title.
It really is. But our mission today is to tear down this assumption that 20th century religious charity was just, well-meaning volunteers handing out bowls of soup while singing hymns.
Right, the stereotype.
Yeah, we are going to unpack how these organizations engineered these massive, ruthlessly efficient corporate structures and how they collided 1970s psychological theory with uncompromising old-fashioned evangelism.
And to truly grasp the stakes of this manual, we really have to look closely at the evolution of the people they were actually trying to serve. I mean, poverty is a constant human companion.
Oh, absolutely. Always has been.
The text itself even nods to ancient Rome and the Book of Deuteronomy, just to establish that destitution is not some modern invention. But the flavor of that destitution in America changed so violently between the post-Civil War era and the 1970s.
So let's track that evolution, because honestly, the terminology the book uses is a history lesson all by itself.
It really is.
In the late 19th century, starting with the Jerry McAuley Mission in New York in 1872, which Seath notes was the oldest continuously operating mission in the U.S. at the time of publication, the demographic was largely that transient worker we talked about.
The guys building the country.
Right. The book provides this incredible taxonomy of the road. For example, they talk about the Gandhi dancer.
Oh, I love this detail. The origin of that term reveals so much about the era. The Gandhi dancer was a railroad track worker. And the name didn't just, appear out of nowhere.
No, it came from the tools, right?
Exactly. It derived from the tools they used, which were manufactured by the Gandhi Manufacturing Company over in Chicago.
And it wasn't just the brand of the tool on the label. The track foremen, who were sometimes nicknamed Gandhi themselves because of the equipment, they would literally sing out these chants to coordinate the laborers.
To keep them in sync.
Right. They would yell, "Dance, you Gandhis, dance!"
Mm-hmm.
So the men would use this rhythmic, synchronized stepping motion to haul and lay massively heavy iron tracks over the wooden ties. I mean, these were men doing grueling, highly coordinated physical labor.
They definitely weren't beggars.
Not at all. And then you have another category they mention, the hobo.
Which is a term we still use, but usually incorrectly. The distinction the text makes here is crucial for understanding the economic reality of the time. The term hobo comes from hoboys.
Hoboys, like the garden hoe.
Yep. These were early, transient agricultural laborers who just moved across the country following the crop harvests. The defining characteristic of the hobo, according to the mission taxonomy anyway, is that while he roams from place to place, he will work when he needs to.
So he's looking for work.
Exactly. He is a mobile economic engine.
He is providing a totally necessary seasonal service. And that is light years away from how the book defines bums or tramps.
Very different categories in their eyes.
Yeah, the text explicitly categorizes bums and tramps as individuals who lead a roving life but actively avoid and do not desire work. And at the very bottom of this societal hierarchy are the vagrants, who just exist without any visible means of support whatsoever.
So they really had a whole classification system.
We did. So for decades, the rescue mission was essentially catering to the Gandhi dancers and the hoboys, these single, resilient men who just needed a temporary shelter between grueling gigs. But then the entire industrial landscape just shattered.
It did. And the book pinpoints the year 1926 as the beginning of an economic apocalypse for this specific class of worker.
1926. What happened then?
That was the era when modern machinery began to achieve really widespread adoption. You saw the introduction of the combine harvester, which could basically do the work of 100 hoboys in a fraction of the time.
Wow, just completely replacing them.
And mechanical refrigeration suddenly made the massive, labor-intensive ice harvesting industry completely obsolete. So the demand for sheer, unspecialized human muscle collapsed almost overnight.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yes.
Because I want to frame this in a way that resonates with what we are experiencing right now. We look at the year 1926, and we see the exact same existential terror that is gripping society today regarding artificial intelligence and automation.
Oh, that's a really good comparison.
Right. Today, a mid-level coder or a copywriter looks at a generative AI model and realizes their entire economic niche might just vanish in a year.
It's terrifying.
In 1926, a man whose entire livelihood was cutting giant blocks of ice out of frozen lakes stared at a humming mechanical compressor and realized society no longer needed his hands. The hobo wasn't inherently lazy. He was the victim of a ruthless technological pivot.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that was a pivot that was immediately followed by the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933.
Right, the timing couldn't have been worse.
Exactly. The text details how the mission doors, which used to just welcome single working men, were suddenly flooded with entire family units, young children, desperate parents who had lost absolutely everything.
And that trajectory only worsened from there.
It did. By the time William Seath is compiling this handbook in the 1970s, America had become what the text calls computerized.
The computerized America of the 70s,
Yeah.
which created a brutal new reality. If you did not possess a high school diploma, you were virtually unemployable in the new urban economy.
You were locked out.
Completely. This created the hollowed-out ghettos in inner cities. Which actually brings us to the most famous, or maybe infamous term in this entire ecosystem, Skid Row.
Yeah, and the etymology of Skid Row is geographically rooted in Seattle.
Really? Seattle?
Yeah, it was originally called Skid Road. Loggers would literally skid heavy timber down the steep roads to the river and the sawmills.
Oh, literally skidding logs. I never knew that.
Yeah. Over time, the physical location where the most dangerous, grueling work happened became synonymous with the area of town where the transient, the severely handicapped, and the chronically unemployed just sort of congregated.
But the text uncovers a really deep psychological layer to Skid Row. It isn't just a place where poor people happen to end up because, the rent is cheap.
No, it's much more intentional than that.
The book argues that Skid Row is an active destination for people seeking absolute anonymity. It says that on the street, what you have been is your business, and what the other fellow has been is his.
A place to disappear.
Exactly. People deliberately hit the skid because they possess a profound, burning desire to forget their past and to be entirely ignored by polite society.
Which means the mission had to fundamentally alter its approach. I mean, you are no longer serving a resilient lumberjack who just needs a bowl of stew before his next job.
Right, it's a completely different mental state.
You are facing a deeply traumatized urban demographic. You've got broken families, unwed mothers facing intense social stigma, and individuals actively hiding from their own histories. A few volunteers passing out blankets simply cannot manage the multi-generational complexity of that trauma.
So if the demographics mutated, the actual machinery of the mission had to mutate to keep up, which leads us directly into the governance and finance of these institutions.
The nuts and bolts of it.
And I have to admit, reading a handbook written by religious leaders, I totally expected chapters on prayer, fasting, relying on divine providence, that sort of thing.
Sarah, you'd expect that to be front and center.
But instead, I found a manual that reads like a ruthless, pragmatic Harvard Business Review case study on corporate restructuring.
It is surprisingly corporate. William Seath treats the rescue mission not just as a spiritual haven, but as a complex corporate entity that must survive in a really hostile economic environment.
He lays out actual business models.
He outlines 6 distinct types of mission organization. You have the purely independent board, denominational missions run by a specific church body, the highly structured Salvation Army model, and so on. But he spends a massive amount of ink warning against one specific structure, one man control.
Okay, so this is the scenario where a single, highly charismatic individual, often a man who was saved from severe addiction in a mission himself, decides to start his own operation.
A founder, basically.
Right. He runs a building. He doesn't answer to a board of directors. He doesn't report to a larger church body. If he buys property with donated funds, the deed is in his own personal name. And Seath warns that this is an absolute disaster waiting to happen.
He is terrified of this model.
Now, I want to challenge Seath on this point because I really think his corporate bias is showing here.
Okay, how so?
If we look at how emergency aid works on the ground, bureaucracy is so often the enemy of compassion.
Right.
If it is 10 degrees below zero outside and someone is freezing to death on the sidewalk, a single independent founder can instantly decide to open their doors, buy 50 blankets, and save lives.
They don't have to wait for a vote.
Exactly. They don't have to wait 3 weeks for a committee of wealthy suburban board members to convene, review the budget, debate the liability, and take a vote. A founder-led mission has pure, undiluted agility. Why is Seath so terrified of a model that actually allows for immediate emergency action?
Well, your point about agility is totally valid in the short term, but Seath is looking at the institutional lifespan, which outlasts any single winter storm.
He's thinking decades, not days.
Right. He is terrified of one-man control because of the profound legal and ethical vulnerabilities it creates. When a single individual controls public, donated funds without oversight, the public inevitably becomes suspicious. And rightly so. There are no professional audits.
Okay, that makes sense. The money aspect is always tricky.
But the most devastating argument Seath makes is about mortality. If that charismatic executive unexpectedly dies and the mission property is in his name, it legally passes to his family or heirs.
Oh, wow, I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, the mission simply ceases to exist overnight. The neighborhood loses its safety net, the donors lose their investment, and the clients are thrown right back onto the street. You might gain speed in a crisis, but you sacrifice the survival of the entire institution.
Okay, I see the danger.
Yeah.
You really can't build a permanent bridge if the chief engineer holds all the blueprints in his head and then, suffers a heart attack. The risk of total institutional collapse is just too high.
It's too precarious.
So if one-man control is a fatal flaw, what does the Handbook present as the gold standard for governance?
The book strongly advocates for a corporate body appointed by various churches. In this model, every evangelical church in a given city or community officially elects a representative to serve on the mission's board of directors.
The psychology behind that structure is honestly brilliant.
How so?
Well, it completely eliminates the turf wars. If the mission is entirely run by, say, the First Baptist Church, the Presbyterian and Methodist congregations might feel alienated and withhold their funding. But if every church has a seat at the table, it becomes our mission. The entire city feels a sense of ownership and financial responsibility.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, Seath is incredibly strict about who is allowed to sit in those seats. He explicitly warns executives to protect their boards from two specific types of toxic personalities.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
The first are the joiners.
We all know the joiners.
Yeah.
These are the people obsessed with their own civic resumes. They want their name on the letterhead of every prominent charity in the city, so they look good at country club dinners. But when it comes time to review an audit or fundraise, they are completely absent.
Precisely. They absorb a leadership seat, but provides zero labor.
Dead weight.
Exactly. But the second category Seath warns against is far more dangerous to the mission's survival: the anti-church come-outers. The book quotes Dr. W.E. Paul, a prominent mission leader, who states you should avoid these individuals like the smallpox.
Avoid them like the smallpox. It really doesn't get much clearer than that.
It's visceral. An anti-church come-outer is someone who is perpetually aggrieved. They cannot get along with the leadership in their own local congregation.
They're always fighting with somebody.
Always. They're constantly causing schisms, fighting with their pastor, and eventually they come out or leave in a huff. Seath's logic here is irrefutable. If a person lacks the emotional maturity to maintain peaceful, productive relationships within their own local church, they will inevitably import that exact same toxic division, suspicion, and chaos into your mission's boardroom.
It is preventative organizational medicine. And once you have insulated this board from the resume patters and the chronic complainers, you have to tackle the lifeblood of the institution, which is the finances.
Right. Section 6 of the book details how missions keep the lights on.
And while they rely on donations, they also have three primary sources of earned income. They run industrial operations, like fleets of trucks that collect discarded paper, clothing, and furniture to restore and sell.
Like a thrift store model.
Exactly. They charge nominal fees for meals and lodging for clients who actually have an income. And they take in funds for the long-term care of the aged or disabled who receive small pensions. But Seath raises a massive, flashing red flag about that industrial work. He calls it the danger of commercialization.
And this is where the tension between corporate efficiency and spiritual compassion really reaches its breaking point.
Walk us through that.
Let's say your mission runs a massive furniture restoration warehouse to fund the soup kitchen. A client walks in off Skid Row. He is severely alcoholic, but he also happens to be a master carpenter.
Okay.
The danger of commercialization is that the mission leadership begins to view that man primarily as an asset for production, rather than a human soul in need of rescue.
So if the master carpenter is generating thousands of dollars for the mission's bottom line, there is this perverse incentive to keep him exactly where he is.
You don't want him to leave.
Right. You don't want him to graduate from the program, conquer his addiction, and get a job in the private sector because you would lose your best worker. The mission subtly transforms into an exploitative factory. The institution prioritizes the survival of its budget over the rehabilitation of the client.
It's a really dark trap to fall into, and Seath attacks financial mismanagement on multiple fronts. He targets what he calls the nepotic syndrome.
Nepotism is always a red flag.
Definitely. He notes how common it is for a mission executive to hire his wife, his sister, or his nephew to act as a treasurer or bookkeeper simply because of blood loyalty. Seath demands this practice stop immediately. He requires professional, independent auditing.
Because the donors aren't fools. Seath gives this incredibly blunt advice for appealing to large charitable foundations. He says, quote, "Sell the sizzle, not the steak."
Such a 70s marketing phrase.
It really is. He explicitly states that foundations do not want to give money to a worthy cause. They do not want to fund your pity or your good intentions.
They want ROI.
Exactly. They are looking for a solid investment. They want to see a spreadsheet proving that for every dollar they invest, a measurable number of human lives are removed from the welfare rolls and transformed into tax-paying, self-sufficient citizens.
It totally strips away all the romanticism. You're presenting a rigorous business case for human reclamation.
So, we have established the demographic they're dealing with, the traumatized, anonymous residents of Skid Row. We have established the governance, a fiercely protected community-owned board running independent audits and avoiding the nepotic syndrome.
The foundation is set.
Right. Now we have to look at the day-to-day reality. Who is actually staffing this corporate architecture of compassion, and what do the physical buildings actually look like?
Well, the book draws a really sharp line between two tiers of personnel, the administrative staff and the operating staff.
Okay, what's the difference?
The administrative side, the executive director, the department heads, the professional secretaries, they are hired from the outside for their specialized skills. But the operating staff, the men and women cooking the massive vats of stew, the people scrubbing the dormitory floors, the maintenance crews fixing the boilers, and the floor supervisors, the text points out this incredible detail.
I loved this part.
These vital roles are almost universally filled by men and women who were saved and rehabilitated within the mission itself.
Which is amazing. This isn't just a cost-saving measure to avoid hiring outside contractors. It is a foundational pillar of their rehabilitation philosophy.
It's part of the cure.
Right. They are taking individuals who arrived completely broken, guiding them through recovery, and then entrusting them with the keys to the institution. It restores a profound sense of dignity. The client realizes, I am no longer a burden to this place. I am the one keeping it running.
It gives them purpose.
It acts as the ultimate stepping stone between total dependence and re-entering the mainstream workforce.
But orchestrating all of this places a crushing burden on the administrative leadership, specifically the executive director. The book sets the baseline qualification for an executive using a biblical standard from 2 Timothy 3.17, demanding they be thoroughly furnished unto all good works.
That is a heavy mantle to wear.
It is. Yet, amidst all this pressure to manage million-dollar budgets and save desperate souls, Seath issues a startlingly modern warning regarding the executive's mental health and family boundaries.
It is a devastating section of the text. Seath insists that an executive must never neglect their own spouse and children under the guise of doing God's work.
Which is so common back then.
There's this heartbreaking anecdote included in the manual about a highly respected, famous mission executive. His adult daughter comes to him one day and says, "Daddy, when I needed you to help me, you were so busy helping others that you didn't have time to listen to me."
Oof, that hurts to hear.
The manual is telling these leaders, if you save 1,000 men on Skid Row but lose your own children because you were never home, you have failed.
Establishing that kind of boundary in an era and a profession known for martyrdom is truly remarkable. And Seath extends that boundary all the way to the end of the executive's career.
Right, the retirement rule.
Yeah. The Handbook establishes a strict rule for retirement. It advises the leader to step down at age 65. But the critical part of the rule is what happens the day after they retire.
Which is?
They must completely and utterly sever all influence over the mission.
So they can't linger as a consultant?
No, they cannot demand a seat on the board to second-guess the new director. They have to literally walk away from their life's work.
The psychological humility required to build a massive institution, hand over the keys, and disappear so the next generation can lead without your shadow suffocating them. That is incredibly rare in any industry.
It really is. Now, regarding the actual environment these leaders are managing, Chapter 7 pivots to the physical properties, and the dominant theme, repeated almost obsessively, is the critical importance of absolute cleanliness.
Yes. Seath includes this highly revealing anecdote. A church group organizes a tour of a local rescue mission. And before they arrive, their mental image of the place is shaped by stereotypes, right? They expect a dark, foul-smelling, dingy flophouse filled with despair.
That's what people thought Skid Row was.
Exactly. Instead, they walk through the doors and are completely stunned. The floors are gleaming, the chapels are spotless, the dormitories are impeccably organized, and the immediate result of that tour—
Funding.
The church group goes home and permanently adds the mission to their annual missionary budget. The book takes the old adage, cleanliness is next to godliness, entirely literally. They believe that maintaining a pristine building forces a sense of order onto the chaotic lives of the men residing there. But, and I have to stop and push back on this because it feels completely disconnected from the reality of emergency survival.
You don't buy the clean floors argument.
I mean, if a person is shivering in the freezing rain, battling the physical agony of alcohol withdrawal, and hasn't eaten in 3 days, do they genuinely care if the baseboards are dusted?
Probably not in that exact moment.
Does a spotless chapel floor actually matter to a starving man? Or is this obsession with cleanliness just a theatrical performance designed to impress wealthy donors on a walking tour?
Well, it is easy to view it as purely performative for the donors, but if we delve into the psychology of physical space, the obsession with cleanliness is actually a frontline clinical intervention.
Okay, how so?
What's fascinating here is that a dirty, chaotic, run-down mission actively reinforces the client's deepest internal narrative, which is a narrative of profound worthlessness.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. If you take a traumatized, broken person and place them into a room with peeling paint, filthy floors, and a foul odor, the institution is silently communicating to them, this is what you are worth. You are garbage, so we put you in a garbage environment.
Wow.
By demanding absolute shining cleanliness, the mission is physically attacking the client's self-loathing. The pristine environment is a spatial assertion of the client's inherent human dignity.
That reframes the entire concept for me. The mop and the bucket aren't just cleaning tools. They are psychological weapons against despair.
Exactly. They set the baseline of respect.
But the spotless physical environment is just the necessary stage, right? The actual rigorous work of rebuilding the human mind happens during the services and in the counseling room. And this is where we see the most fascinating collision in the entire handbook, the intersection of rigid theology and 1970s psychological theory.
It is a wild mix. The book unequivocally calls the gospel service the heart of the rescue mission. Just as a biological heart pumps blood to the extremities, this service pumps the core message of redemption throughout the entire institution.
And because the stakes were so high, Seath laid out incredibly strict rules for the well-meaning middle-class church groups who volunteered to lead these services.
He was not messing around with the volunteers.
Not at all. The instructions are brutally practical. First, he tells them, do not try to use street slang. Don't try to sound tough or relatable to the men on the street. They will immediately spot the inauthenticity.
They'll see right through it.
Second, keep your personal testimonies short and to the point. Third, do not play amateur theologian and attempt to debate complex, divisive church doctrines.
Nobody needs a theological debate when they're starving.
Right. And the ultimate rule, the one that sets the gravity of the room, realize that some of the men sitting in those wooden pews might be hearing a message of hope for the absolute last time in their lives before they die on the street. Do not waste their time.
It's sobering, but the theology of the chapel service had to be paired with the intimate one-on-one reality of the counseling room. And this is where the handbook becomes intensely analytical.
It really gets into the weeds of psychology.
It does. The author explicitly contrasts the Christian view of human rehabilitation with 5 dominant secular schools of psychology from that era: Freud, Adler, Watson, Gestalt, and McDougall.
So to understand what Seath is arguing against, we need to quickly map out what these 5 schools actually represent.
Let's do it.
You have Sigmund Freud, whose psychoanalysis focuses heavily on the unconscious mind, repressed childhood traumas, and hidden sexual drives. Then you have Alfred Adler, who broke away from Freud to focus on the individual's deep-seated feelings of inferiority and their lifelong drive for power and significance.
Then you have John B. Watson and the behaviorists. They essentially treat the human mind like a complex machine. They believe behavior is entirely the result of conditioning, stimulus, and response, and that by altering the environment and the rewards, you can literally program a person out of their destructive habits.
Like Pavlov's dogs.
Exactly. Gestalt psychology takes a totally different route, arguing that we must look at the human experience as a holistic pattern, emphasizing that the whole of human perception is greater than just the sum of its mechanical parts. And finally, William McDougall championed a theory based on innate biological instincts driving human behavior.
Now, as we discuss this, we need to be incredibly clear. We are maintaining strict neutrality here. We are not endorsing one psychological theory over another, nor are we validating the book's theological stance.
Right, we're just analyzing the text.
We are purely analyzing how this 1974 institution navigated these ideas. And Seath's stance is really fascinating. He doesn't completely dismiss these secular schools as useless.
No, he finds some value in them.
He acknowledges that they provide brilliant mechanical maps of how human behavior operates. But he argues they ultimately fail because they treat the human being purely as a biological or neurological machine.
They miss the spiritual component.
According to the handbook, secular psychology can diagnose the behavioral malfunction, but it cannot cure the spiritual void because it refuses to acknowledge the existence of a soul that requires reconciliation with God.
So the mission counselor was expected to understand the mechanics of the mind while applying a spiritual cure. And to understand what specific malfunction they were trying to cure, the text introduces a massive paradigm-shifting piece of data.
This blew my mind.
They reference extensive sociological studies conducted in Chicago in 1962 and 1963, which analyzed thousands of individual case records of men living on Skid Row.
See, if you ask the average person on the street, what causes a man to end up destitute on Skid Row, they will almost universally point to 2 things: severe alcoholism or a fundamental rebellious refusal to work.
Those are the standard assumptions.
But the Chicago studies revealed something entirely different. The dominating root factor driving these thousands of men into the gutter was fear.
Fear, not booze. Fear.
The specific varieties of fear were paralyzing. Fear of failure, so they refused to try. Fear of success, the terror that if they achieve something, they won't be able to maintain it.
Self-sabotage.
Right. Fear of the overwhelming complexities of life. And a pervasive, haunting fear of death. The alcohol wasn't the root cause. The alcohol was merely the anesthetic they used to numb the terror.
And to combat this deeply entrenched fear, the book outlines a highly structured 4-step counseling framework called the 4 Fs. Find, filter, focus, and follow.
Walk us through the 4 Fs.
It begins with finding the underlying truth of the client's history, cutting through the lies and defensive walls. Then, the counselor must filter reality from the client's deeply ingrained paranoia and imagination.
Sorting fact from fiction.
Exactly. Once the reality is isolated, they focus entirely on the real root problem, which is often an unaddressed trauma, not the surface-level addiction. And finally, they follow through to a concrete, spiritual, and practical solution.
But inside this framework is a warning that absolutely shocked me. I mean, you would assume that a handbook for gospel rescue missions would encourage its counselors to loudly and repeatedly declare Jesus is the answer to every single problem.
It seems like that would be page 1.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Seath explicitly and forcefully warns his counselors against using the cliche, Christ is the answer.
It is a profound warning against what modern therapists would call spiritual bypassing.
Seath argues that if a client sits down, shaking, carrying decades of complex trauma, fear, and grief, and the counselor glibly throws a bumper sticker slogan at them like, "Christ is the answer," without doing the excruciatingly hard work of unpacking that trauma, the counselor commits a grave error.
They're taking a shortcut.
By relying on a cliché to shut down the conversation, the counselor actually robs the client of their personal agency. You stunt their mental and emotional growth by refusing to let them grapple with their own reality.
This demonstrates a staggering level of psychological sophistication for the era. The text demands that mission workers understand complex mental states. For instance, it requires them to recognize autophobia.
Autophobia, the fear of oneself.
Essentially, yes. Autophobia is the morbid, terrifying fear of being alone, of isolation, and of one's own self. The book notes this is rampant among the Skid Row demographic. To treat a man suffering from autophobia, you cannot just yell scripture at him. You have to practice deep, active listening.
The book draws a hard line between two styles of engagement here. It strongly warns against directive counseling.
Right, which was very popular at the time.
Directive counseling is when the counselor completely dominates the session. They talk 80% of the time, they diagnose the problem immediately, and they dictate a list of orders for the client to follow.
But directive counseling fails because if you just order a broken person around, they might obey out of compliance, but you haven't helped them rebuild the mental muscles required to make independent choices.
They're just following orders.
Exactly. When they leave your office, they will immediately collapse.
Therefore, the book champions the non-directive, or client-centered approach. The counselor acts as a mirror, using deep empathy to guide the client toward discovering the truth themselves. You cannot command a traumatized person to heal with a megaphone. You have to walk with them through the dark.
But if active listening and uncovering deep-seated fear was the cure, a massive logistical problem emerges. The fear paralyzing a 16-year-old runaway is fundamentally different from the fear paralyzing a 60-year-old chronic alcoholic. The fear of a deserted mother is entirely different from the fear of a man newly released from a state penitentiary.
Right, you can't treat them all the same way.
The traditional one-size-fits-all soup kitchen and chapel service was failing to address these distinct realities. To save the individual, the institution had to fracture its services.
They had to specialize. Which brings us to Section 5, Specialized Ministries. The mission could no longer just be a warehouse for single men. They had to build entirely separate, highly targeted ecosystems.
Tailored solutions.
For example, they developed extensive women's services. And in this section, the handbook delivers a very specific, somewhat bleak warning to the social workers dealing with women and families in severe crisis. They warn against developing the Messiah complex.
The Messiah complex.
Yeah.
This is the occupational hazard of the deeply compassionate. It is the delusional belief that you possess the power to save absolutely everyone who walks through your door.
Let's make this tangible. Imagine a young, deeply faithful social worker at the mission. A mother comes in with 3 children. Her husband has completely abandoned them, drained the bank accounts, and vanished.
A total crisis.
And the mother also has a severe, unalterable physical handicap that prevents her from working most jobs. The social worker prays, gives them groceries, and works 80-hour weeks trying to piece this family's life back together.
They give everything they have.
But eventually, the worker hits a wall of utter despair. They realize that no amount of prayer or donated canned goods is going to magically materialize a deserting father, and it isn't going to cure a permanent physical disability. The worker burns out, loses their faith, and quits the profession entirely.
And Seath is trying to inoculate his staff against that exact burnout. The handbook demands that workers accept their own profound limitations. You are not the Messiah. You cannot fix every broken variable in a tragic universe.
It's a hard pill to swallow.
It is. You must learn to provide fierce, consistent care while accepting that some suffering cannot be immediately solved.
Another massive pivot was youth work. The philosophy here was pure prevention. I mean, why wait until a man is 50 years old and dying on Skid Row to intervene? Reach the children in the hollowed-out inner cities before they ever hit the street.
Kept them early.
The guiding principle for the youth camps was discipline with love. But again, Seath pushes back against the quick fix. He strictly warns the youth workers. Do not try to manipulate the environment to get every single child saved, or to make a religious commitment in the first week of camp.
He was against emotional manipulation.
Completely. If you force an emotional response, it will vanish the moment they go back to the city. The goal is long-term, permanent, structural change in the child's life, not generating impressive statistics for the monthly newsletter.
But for those who are already deeply entrenched in addiction, the noise and chaos of the inner city mission simply wasn't enough. A man suffering from severe delirium tremens cannot recover while hearing police sirens and traffic outside his window.
The environment is just too stimulating.
So the missions developed farms for alcoholics. They utilized what the book refers to as the Keswick colony concept.
What exactly does that concept entail?
Well, the term originates from the Keswick Convention in England, which focused on spiritual renewal and deep personal holiness achieved by separating oneself from the distractions of the world.
Like a retreat.
Kind of, but much more intense. In the context of the rescue mission, the Keswick colony concept meant total rural isolation. They purchased large plots of farmland far outside the city limits. And the absolute non-negotiable rule for a client entering the farm program was an 8-week or 60-day minimum stay.
And there is a harsh physiological reality behind that 60-day rule. If a man has been drinking heavily for a decade, his nervous system is completely fried.
It takes time to heal.
If you just give him a bed for a weekend, you haven't even allowed the alcohol to fully leave his bloodstream. You need a minimum of 8 weeks just for the physical brain chemistry to stabilize, the tremors to stop, and the nervous system to decompress from the constant adrenaline-fueled survival mode of the city.
The text provides a beautiful, highly specific anecdote to illustrate the power of this rural decompression. It tells the story of a man named Benny.
Oh, a Benny story.
Yeah. Benny was not uneducated. He was a college graduate with a degree in electronics, but alcohol had completely dismantled his life, stripping away his career, his relationships, and his self-respect. He hit absolute rock bottom and was brought out to the mission farm.
They nursed Benny through the agonizing physical withdrawal, the shakes. But a cure wasn't just sitting in a quiet room reading. It was the physical labor of the farm.
Hard work.
Benny's specific work assignment was to help the brood sows birth little pigs in the barn. Think about the profound contrast here. This is a man whose entire previous identity was tied to complex, lifeless electronic circuits in a high-tech industry.
A very sterile environment.
He lost it all, and he finally recovers his self-worth, his sanity, and his dignity, not by fixing radios, but by plunging his hands into the dirt and assisting in the raw, messy, miraculous process of bringing actual new life into the world. The farm physically reconnected him to the rhythms of reality.
The institutional reach extended even further into jail and hospital services. But true to form, Seath's advice for the workers visiting the local penitentiaries is fiercely pragmatic.
He doesn't pull punches.
He instructs his chaplains, never, under any circumstances, promise an inmate that you will get them out of jail. Do not offer to call the judge. Do not try to play amateur lawyer.
Because the moment you promise legal help and fail, you have destroyed all trust, and you become just another system that lied to them.
You lose all credibility.
Seath says to keep the focus entirely on internal spiritual freedom. You must realize that the deep psychological needs of a man sitting in a steel cage are fundamentally the exact same needs as the man sitting in the suburban country club.
And speaking of the suburbs, the book details a brilliant program designed to bridge that exact geographical and class divide, the Chaplain of the Week program.
Oh, this was such a clever idea. The mission would invite pastors from wealthy, comfortable suburban congregations to leave their manicured lawns and come live and work at the inner city mission for a solid week.
Total immersion.
They would teach classes, eat in the dining hall, and conduct the 4F's counseling sessions with men straight off Skid Row. This solved two massive problems at once. First, it provided the men in the mission with a fresh voice and a new perspective, preventing them from getting numb to the same staff members every single day.
But the second, and arguably more profound benefit was what it did to the visiting suburban pastor.
The culture shock.
Yeah. After spending a week counseling men whose lives had been destroyed by fear, hidden addictions, and broken marriages on Skid Row, that pastor would return to his wealthy congregation. And as he looked out over the pews filled with doctors, lawyers, and executives, he would realize that his wealthy congregants were suffering from the exact same hidden autophobia, the exact same secret addictions, and the exact same marital despair as the men in the mission.
Wow. It levels the playing field completely.
It does. The only difference was that the wealthy could afford to hide their trauma behind expensive front doors. It completely shattered the illusion of us versus them.
But reading about this relentless, overwhelming tide of human suffering, the third and fourth generation hardcore poverty, the terrified runaways, the relapsing alcoholics, I have to ask, how does anyone actually survive this work?
It has to be exhausting.
How do you stare into the abyss of a computerized 1970s ghetto every single day without completely losing your mind to despair?
Well, the answer the text provides is a fierce commitment to the philosophy of Reconstruction. If your goal is mere relief, if your only metric for success is handing a man a bowl of soup so he survives until Tuesday, you will burn out quickly because he will just be hungry again on Wednesday.
You're just bailing water.
You're endlessly applying Band-Aids to a gaping wound. But Reconstruction is about teaching self-sufficiency. It is the physiological wisdom of the farm program, rebuilding the nervous system. You survive the work only when you witness actual structural reconstruction of a human mind and body.
Which perfectly and brutally sets up the final and frankly most shocking revelation of this entire handbook, the ultimate goal.
The big finale.
We have spent an hour looking at the intricate architecture of these institutions, the multi-million-dollar physical plants, the highly vetted corporate boards, the spotless chapels, the massive rural farms. It is a sprawling empire of charity. But Seath makes a stunning, radical admission. If the mission becomes the client's entire world, the mission has completely and utterly failed.
It is a breathtaking display of organizational humility. Seath outlines a tragic, self-perpetuating loop that he calls the cycle. It is a geographical, social, and economic trap that ensnares the vulnerable.
Let's trace the geography of this trap. A man starts his week in a cheap, lonely, isolating hotel room. The autophobia, the fear of being alone creeps in.
The fear we talked about.
Right. To escape the silence, he goes down to the local bar and gets heavily intoxicated. In his stupor, he causes a disturbance, gets arrested by the police, and is sentenced to spend 7 to 90 days in the county jail.
And while in jail, he is forcibly detoxed. He gets out sober, but he is overwhelmed by a crushing wave of remorse, guilt, and a realization of how far he's fallen. He cannot face normal society.
So what does he do?
Seeking absolution and a safe harbor, he goes to the rescue mission.
At the mission, he plays the game. He attends the chapel services. He eats the hot meals. He enters the industrial program and earns a small paycheck restoring furniture. But as soon as the physical pain of withdrawal is gone and he has a few dollars in his pocket from the mission's industrial yard, he leaves the mission.
Now, where does he go?
He walks right back to a cheap, lonely, isolating hotel room, and the cycle instantly restarts.
Seath is brutally honest about why secular halfway houses, city hospitals, and even poorly managed religious missions ultimately fail these men. Because after providing temporary relief, they eventually release the man right back onto the exact same street corner he came from.
Nothing structural changed.
They change his blood alcohol level, but they do not alter his geography or his community.
Seath introduces a chilling concept here called saturation. A client who has been through the cycle a dozen times becomes totally numb to the mission's environment. They learn how to pacify the preacher.
They know the script.
They know exactly when to nod during the sermon, when to say amen, and how to use the psychological jargon in the counseling room to convince the staff they are cured, just to secure a warm bed and a meal. They learn to survive the system without ever experiencing internal change.
To combat this institutional saturation, the author introduces the defining climactic metaphor of the entire handbook, the lifeboat versus the shore.
This is it. This is the core philosophy that justifies the existence of the entire corporate structure we've been discussing. The spotless floors, the highly vetted board of directors, the 4 F's of the counseling room, the rural pig farms, all of these are simply the wooden planks, the nails, and the oars used to construct a lifeboat.
A rescue vessel.
The mission is a lifeboat designed to row out into the freezing, chaotic waters of addiction and poverty and pull drowning people from the waves. But, and this is the absolute crux of the issue, a lifeboat is not designed to be lived in permanently.
Right. If you simply pull a drowning man into a lifeboat and then you just row around in circles in the middle of the dark ocean for 5 years, eventually that passenger will succumb to despair, restlessness, or madness, and they will throw themselves right back over the side into the freezing water.
So what does this all mean? The ultimate goal of the lifeboat is to reach the shore. And in Seath's paradigm, the shore is reintegrating the client into normal, mainstream society, specifically by anchoring them to a local, healthy Christian church outside of Skid Row.
Getting them off the boat.
The mission's entire job is to row them to the shore, let them step off the boat onto solid ground, and then row away.
And this is precisely why the International Union of Gospel Missions, the IUGM, founded back in 1913, existed. They acted as the governing body, demanding that individual missions across the globe maintain this impossibly high standard through rigorous on-the-job training.
Keeping the missions accountable.
They fought to ensure that these massive, million-dollar institutions never devolved into permanent holding pens for the poor. It requires an almost unnatural level of humility for an executive to look at their sprawling empire and admit that it is ultimately just a temporary stepping stone.
To make yourself obsolete.
Success is defined by the moment your client walks out the front door, joins a local community, and never, ever needs to see your face again.
Let's pull back and look at the massive terrain we have covered today. We started in the post-Civil War era, examining the rhythms of the Gandhi dancers and the hoboys. We watched the technological crash of 1926 wipe out human muscle, and we navigated the computerized ghettos of the 1970s.
We covered a century of poverty.
We sat in the ruthless, community-owned boardrooms required to legally and financially protect charity. We debated the psychological warfare of a spotless floor. We watched counselors navigate the terror of autophobia using the 4 Fs, and we traveled out to the rural isolation of the Keswick farms, where broken men found their dignity by bringing new life into the world.
It's an incredible evolution.
The overarching, inescapable theme of this 1974 handbook is that true rescue requires the aggressive marriage of a pragmatic, almost cold corporate architecture with a fiercely personal, unwavering spiritual compassion.
It is an operating manual that recognizes a fundamental truth. You need both the rigid accountability of the spreadsheet and the empathetic, deep soul work of the counseling room to actually reconstruct a human life. You cannot have one without the other.
You absolutely cannot. So, after all of this, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today as you look at the world around you.
What is it?
Think deeply about the social safety nets currently operating in your own city or community right now. It doesn't matter if they are run by massive government bureaucracies, secular nonprofits, or local religious organizations. Look at how they function and ask yourself this profound question. Are they operating as a bridge to the shore?
A bridge or a boat?
Exactly. Is their daily structural goal to actively make themselves obsolete in a person's life? Or, despite their massive budgets and their very best intentions, have they accidentally become a permanent, circling lifeboat, a place where desperate people simply learn how to pacify the system in order to survive another day?
That is the ultimate, uncompromising metric for any system of human care.
It truly is. Thank you so much for joining us and taking this deep dive into the architecture of compassion. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking deeper into the systems around you, and we will see you next time.